The world is just constantly bombarding us with events, right? With statistics and individual stories. It's loud, and a lot of the time it's just confusing.
Mm.
But what if you could take a stack of sources, articles, research papers, even just your own observations, and not just understand what happened, but really understand why it happened?
That's the goal.
That is the core, the essential promise of sociology. You look at something mundane, a simple city street, a family dinner, the aisle of a store, and you start asking these fundamental questions. Why is society structured like this? Or, maybe more crucially, is this pattern I'm seeing just my own experience, or is it part of something, well, something much, much bigger?
And that systematic curiosity is exactly where we have to start.
Hmm.
Sociology is really the scientific practice of observing and documenting those very patterns.
Okay.
Our mission today is to move pretty quickly from that general sociological framework into a really focused lens.
Yeah.
Sociology of gender. We're not here to just, give you a list of definitions.
Right.
We're going to hand you a robust set of tools, a foundational toolkit, really, that lets you interpret the world not as just some random collection of individual choices, but as this intricate structure where history and culture and power dynamics, they shape every single outcome we see.
We're aiming to give you the ultimate shortcut to being well-informed on this topic.
Yeah.
And we really don't have to look very far to see why this kind of deep dive is so essential right now. You can open any news feed and find these immediate, real-world examples that just absolutely demand a sociological explanation because they're so clearly rooted in structure, not accident.
For sure.
I mean, think about the continuing documented pay gap between men and women. That is not some statistical anomaly. It's systemic. It's about occupational segregation and the devaluation of certain kinds of labor.
Or you could consider the ongoing, often ferocious, political and legal battles over new state laws that limit transgender and non-binary individuals' use of public restrooms, or restrict access to necessary medical care. That isn't a simple logistical debate about, plumbing. It's a social structure, actively reinforcing a very rigid, specific, and often historically enforced idea about what gender must be.
And even on the micro level, I mean, the socialization that begins in childhood is this constant sociological experiment. Just walk into any major retailer and see those separate, strictly gendered aisles. You've got the pink toys over here, all focused on domesticity, duty, and nurturing, and then the blue toys over there, focused on building, aggression, and technology.
Right.
It immediately begs the question, who decided those dividing lines, and what is this fundamental structuring teaching children about the full range of options that are available to them in life?
All of those examples, the pay gap, the legal restrictions, those toy aisles, they're classic illustrations of what sociologists would categorize as a social problem.
Okay, so that's a key term.
It is. It's any behavior or issue that is large enough to require some kind of structural addressing because it consistently produces a negative impact or consequence on a large number of members of society.
I see.
Sociologists research these topics precisely to move the discussion from, say, anecdotal experience to evidence-based solutions.
So to really analyze these patterns, we need to quickly establish the foundational language we'll be using throughout this deep dive. Let's start with the discipline itself.
Sociology, at its most basic, is the scientific and systematic study of groups, group interactions, societies, and social structures.
Okay.
We conduct research that ranges from the micro level, so small personal interactions in groups, all the way up to the macro level, where we're analyzing large, stable institutions like governments or economies.
And the key word there is systematic.
The key word is systematic. It has to follow a rigorous scientific methodology.
And those groups we're studying, they're held together by what we call culture.
Culture is a group's entire shared way of life. It's the whole package. Their practices, their deeply held values, their collective beliefs, and the norms they adhere to.
So everything.
It encompasses everything produced by a society, from the abstract social rules we follow to the routine, everyday interactions that we just take for granted. It's sort of the invisible air we breathe that tells us how to behave.
So if sociology is the lens we're using and culture is the environment we're studying, then social problems are kind of the symptoms of a structural dysfunction within that environment.
That's a great way to put it.
Understanding how those three pieces fit together, the scientific method, the cultural environment, and the resulting problems, that's our entry point. Okay, let's unpack this essential toolkit, starting with, I guess, the very first step,
Mhm.
just noticing social patterns.
Right.
Once you're aware that society labels some things normal and other things deviant, or that certain expectations are only applied to one gender, you are already, in a way, observing the social world sociologically.
You're doing the work.
But just seeing the pattern isn't enough. To make sense of the chaos and connect it all to history, we need the ultimate framework.
And that framework is arguably the single most crucial concept in this field. It was developed by the American sociologist C. Wright Mills, and it's called the sociological imagination.
Okay.
And it is far more than just simple curiosity. It is an active, demanding awareness of the profound relationship between a person's individual, personal behavior or experience and the much wider culture, history, and social structure that shaped those choices and perceptions.
And here is where the distinction gets really interesting, because this is the intellectual pivot point that changes how you see your own life. Typically, when we experience something significant, a career choice, the decision to live in a city, the choice to marry or not, we instinctively view it in highly individualistic terms.
Right. It's all about me.
Exactly. We assume the outcome is based solely on our unique merits, our hard work, our personal choices, or, our lack thereof.
But the sociological imagination demands that you connect that seemingly personal experience to these massive, impersonal, structural patterns and context.
Okay, so give me an example.
For example, let's take that deeply personal choice to marry. An individual sees it as love, chemistry, timing.
Of course.
But the sociologist connects it to trends. The economic viability of young people, the demographic availability of partners, whether one's specific gender identity or sexual identity is even legally or socially acceptable, and whether the institution of marriage is culturally valued in the first place.
So the sociological imagination moves us from the deeply subjective personal experience to the objective structural analysis. It helps us differentiate, as Mills laid out, between personal troubles and public issues.
Precisely. A personal trouble is something that affects one individual or maybe a small number of people in a limited social setting. If one person in a town can't find a job because they lack a specific skill for an open position, that's a personal trouble.
Solvable through what? Job training.
It's exactly solvable through job training. But if millions of people across the country, all with varied skills and backgrounds, are unemployed due to a massive economic recession or the structural decline of an entire industry, that is a public issue.
I see.
It is rooted not in individual failure, but in the structure of society itself. And it requires a structural solution, like national policy changes or large-scale public works.
This distinction is just vital because when we apply it to gender, it changes the conversation from why did she fail to what structural limitations were imposed on her success.
And this structural understanding leads us naturally to the concept of social facts. These are the often unseen social currents that govern our lives.
Social facts, okay.
They are the laws, the morals, the values, religious beliefs, customs, the accepted fashions, the rituals, all those cultural rules that collectively govern social life.
So everything in the background.
Yeah, the sociologist Emil Durkheim, who developed this concept, described them as forces that exist outside the individual, often preceding them and constraining their actions.
That's a fascinating idea that these forces exist independently of us. It's not just a collection of individuals choosing to follow a rule. The rule itself has a life of its own.
It does. I mean, think of the structure of the U.S. educational system. Whether you as an individual attend college or not, the entire system of degrees, majors, accreditation, and student debt exists as a social fact.
It was there before me, and it'll be there after me.
Exactly. It's an independent, constraining force that determines your economic possibilities. The moment you are born, that structure is already operating. Social facts are like the background operating system of society that dictates what is possible and what is deemed impossible.
So if we apply the sociological imagination to these social facts, what kind of large-scale structural changes can we study? For instance, how do sociologists track the evolution of something as seemingly stable as the family?
We study profound, measurable structural shifts, and we do so comparatively. We can examine how the views on marriage and family have changed dramatically over time in the United States. And we can juxtapose that against how those same concepts are viewed in a society with a different economic structure or religious history, say Peru or Japan. What influences these shifts?
It touches feelings.
It's not just feelings. Sociologists look beyond individual sentiments and analyze employment trends, housing access, economic conditions, and cultural rules about reproduction and kinship. all of which play a massive role in shaping what a family even looks like, or who is expected to perform caregiving labor.
And the power of the imagination is that it connects the macro to the micro.
Okay.
It shows how shifts in the global economy suddenly affect whether an individual can afford to get married or have children. It's an awareness that everything we do, even the definition of what constitutes the stable family unit,
Yeah.
is profoundly shaped by these impersonal, distant social forces. I think the most vital part of the sociological perspective is this insistence that the individual and society are fundamentally inseparable.
They are.
You simply cannot understand a person's life trajectory, their challenges, or their opportunities without factoring in the social structure they were born into. It's like trying to understand the flight of a bird without understanding gravity or the prevailing wind currents.
That concept of dynamic interdependence was captured so eloquently by the German sociologist Norbert Elias, who termed it figuration.
Figuration.
Figuration is the process of looking at the behavior of individuals and the constantly evolving dynamic society that shapes and is shaped by that behavior.
Okay.
Elias argued that sociologists cannot look at institutions or systems as mere abstract entities. Individuals must be figured, integrated, and recognized into the analysis of those institutions. A society is just a web of interdependent people.
Let's use a complex institutional example beyond simple prayer to see how figuration works. What about something like higher education?
If we look at higher education, we see individuals making choices. Which school to attend, which major to choose, whether to take on debt.
The personal troubles.
The personal troubles, yes. But figuration forces us to see that the institution, the university, it only exists through the ongoing practices of millions of individuals. The students who enroll, the professors who teach, the administrators who set policy, the legislators who allocate funding.
So it's a living thing.
It is. If enough people stop enrolling, or if governments stop funding, the figuration of the university changes or collapses entirely. The individual choices are influenced by the structure, but collectively, those choices are the structure.
And we see that structure maintaining historical norms, even when legal systems attempt neutrality. You mentioned the U.S. Constitution calling for a separation of church and state.
Exactly. Even though we have this foundational legal mandate, the social structure, the figuration of our culture, is still heavily influenced by historical religious dominance, primarily Christianity in the U.S. We see this in government practices that reveal the continued social force of that specific religion within a supposedly secular social structure. Think about legal definitions of marriage, the political power of certain religious lobbies influencing health and education policies, or even the debate around the timing of public holidays.
It's everywhere.
The social structure of religion is not just historical. It is actively performed and maintained by individuals in positions of institutional power today.
So let's solidify what that social structure is. If figuration is the dynamic process, the social structure is kind of the fixed architecture of that process.
A social structure is essentially a set of long-lasting social relationships, entrenched practices, and stable institutions that are organized in a specific way and work together to fundamentally limit possibilities.
Okay.
It's the framework of society, and it's difficult to see because it's the water we swim in.
I like that analogy you used of visible structures like buildings or the human skeletal system to make it concrete.
The skeleton provides the structure for the body. It allows specific movements, walking, reaching, bending forward, but it fundamentally limits others, like bending your knee backward or spontaneously dissolving into liquid.
Right. I can't do that.
You can't. That structure is essential, but it is also rigid. Social structures like the patriarchal organization of work or institutionalized racism, they operate the same way.
I see.
They provide a predictable, stable framework for social life. But in doing so, they also pre-select the paths individuals can take. These structures don't spontaneously disappear or change location. They can deteriorate over time or suffer injuries, but altering them requires massive collective force, sustained effort, and often generational struggle.
And that framework is why sociologists study large groups, not just individuals. When millions of people are experiencing the same pressures, say economic or legal, it validates that the structure is at work, forcing choices toward a common pattern.
The profound changes we've seen in family structure in the U.S. provide a rich illustrative example of how these large-scale pressures create measurable patterns in human behavior.
For a century, the culturally prescribed ideal was this narrowly defined heterosexual married couple with children. But today, the data shows that this is far from the only norm.
We have documented shifts showing a rising percentage of unmarried couples living together, a growth in legally recognized same-sex couples, complex blended families from divorce and remarriage, and a significant rise in single-parent or single-adult households.
And this isn't random.
This isn't random. It reflects major economic and cultural shifts that have destabilized the old nuclear family model. Crucially, the data reveals specific gendered patterns in those shifts.
We have that compelling data point from the 2020 U.S. Census Bureau that really grounds the issue of gendered responsibilities. 15 million mothers are single parents, compared to only 3.5 million fathers raising children alone.
That massive disparity highlights a clear, ongoing pattern in caregiving responsibilities related to gender. While the family structure itself has changed, the underlying social structure still dictates that women bear the brunt of the single-parent burden. Whether due to economic disadvantage, lower earning potential after divorce, or continued cultural expectations around maternal responsibility. The individual choices were made, but the structural results fall predictably along gender lines.
And these changing family patterns highlight the incredible weight of the norm that they are pushing against. This brings us directly to the concept that maintains this ideal family structure even as it crumbles: heteronormativity.
Heteronormativity, at its core, is the everyday, pervasive, taken-for-granted assumption that heterosexuality is the default, the natural, and the only privileged form of sexuality and romantic relationship throughout society.
So the assumption of straightness.
It's the assumption of straightness in every interaction until proven otherwise.
And this assumption starts shockingly young, often before children are even in school. It's not just institutional, it is deeply familial.
Sociologist Karen Martin's research on childhood is fascinating evidence of this. She observed interactions and conversations, finding that when children were as young as 3 and 5, parents routinely assumed their children were heterosexual.
3 and 5.
3 and 5. Parents would talk about their young children definitely getting heterosexually married, and they would interpret simple cross-gender interactions between children, a boy and girl playing together, as concrete signs of future heterosexuality.
Wow.
The socialization begins before self-awareness, normalizing this one path above all others.
That pervasive, invisible assumption feeds directly into the systemic problem known as compulsory heterosexuality. This concept, which was popularized by the poet and critic Adrienne Rich back in 1980, describes a coercive system.
It's a powerful critique because it frames heterosexuality not as a choice or a natural state, but as a system of oppression.
Oppression.
Compulsory heterosexuality denies people's full sexual self-determination by relentlessly presenting heterosexuality as the sole acceptable model of sexual and romantic relationships. And it is enforced across all our major institutions: political, religious, legal, familial, educational, which all work in concert to maintain the legal and social privilege of man-woman couplings.
And while Rich initially focused on how this system erases lesbian existence, the system exerts coercion on everyone.
Absolutely. It pressures straight individuals to marry and reproduce according to a prescribed model, often pushing them into life paths they might not have otherwise chosen, simply because it is the only one celebrated and supported institutionally.
Right.
And for LGBTQIA+ people, the system actively creates legal and social inequality.
What are the tangible institutional mechanisms of coercion and resulting inequality we see today?
The examples are stark, particularly in the legal realm. For instance, before the 2017 Supreme Court ruling in Pavan v. Smith, same-sex spouses were often denied the right to be listed automatically on their child's birth certificate in many states.
So it treated their relationship as less legitimate.
Exactly. And while landmark rulings have provided some federal protection, states continue to innovate laws that explicitly allow discrimination against LGBTQIA+ individuals in critical areas like second parent adoption, foster care licensing, and parental presumption in same-sex relationships.
So the structure is actively resisting the social changes we discussed earlier. And tragically, these structural biases play out in personal ways in the courtroom.
In deeply damaging ways. We still see court cases where members of the LGBTQIA+ community lose custody battles over their children simply because of institutionalized homophobia, the entrenched fear or prejudice against them.
So it's not just an idea, it's a real-world consequence.
The sociological research isn't just focused on abstract ideas here. It documents precisely how these entrenched social norms, maintained by institutional support, translate into tangible, measurable harm in real lives. The structure has defined who is worthy of a family and who is not. Before we delve deeper into gender, it is so critical we pause and address a persistent misconception. that studying people in society is somehow less rigorous than studying physical matter.
Right, that it's soft.
Exactly. We must stress unequivocally that sociology is a scientific and evidence-based discipline. It is not just opinion or common sense.
We use the scientific method, which ensures our findings move beyond personal anecdotes and become reliable, generalizable knowledge.
Exactly. Sociology adheres to strict codes of conduct, rigor, oversight of research, and validation of any public statements made. We gather and utilize diverse forms of data, everything from large-scale quantitative statistics, numbers, to deeply analytical qualitative narratives.
Stories and experiences.
Right. Recorded experiences and interviews, all to define and describe social reality. We are one of the social sciences, working alongside fields like economics, anthropology, and psychology, all using systematic research to understand various aspects of human thought and behavior within a structured environment.
But the goal of sociology is different from, say, physics. We aren't aiming to create hard and fast universal laws, but rather to yield generalizations. These are statements of tendency or probability.
A statement of tendency is probabilistic. For example, a sociologist might state, men are more likely than women to commit suicide, or young people were more likely to vote for one political candidate over another. Crucially, this generalization does not mean that every single man commits suicide, or that every single young person voted that specific way. It means the overall rate or probability for the large group follows that pattern, and we can then investigate the structural factors that create that disparity.
That probabilistic nature is the key contrast with the physical world. I mean, the law of gravity describes a force that exists universally and always has the same result. If I drop a pen 1 billion times, it will fall 1 billion times.
Right.
If it didn't, the physical world would instantly require revolutionizing.
And that's the point where social science becomes both the fascination and the frustration of the researcher.
Ah, I bet.
People are shaped profoundly by the social environment, by culture, structure, and social facts, but they are not totally determined by them. We can predict behavior, attitudes, and life chances for large groups with remarkable accuracy, but exceptions are always possible because human beings possess agency and critical thought.
So we can never fully predict one person.
We can never fully explain a single person's life path, only the profound social forces acting upon the millions of people around them.
Let's review the bedrock of this science. We adhere to the scientific method, but let's focus not just on the basic steps, but on the need for objectivity. Why is that specific step, the scientific method, so crucial in the social sciences?
The scientific method, which requires formulating a testable hypothesis, gathering data, analysis, and drawing conclusions, is our bulwark against bias.
Okay.
When we study society, the potential for researcher bias is arguably much higher than in the natural and physical sciences. This is a critical methodological challenge we must constantly address.
I understand why. A chemist's political views typically don't affect how they perform an experiment on a molecule in a sealed beaker.
Precisely. In contrast, social science researchers are studying things they live every day: poverty, gender, racial stratification, or political trends. They often have very strong personal feelings and deeply held beliefs about the topics they study.
And those beliefs could leak in.
They could unconsciously influence everything: which research questions they choose, how they phrase survey questions, how they select interviewees, or most critically, how they interpret the resulting data.
So how does the scientific method specifically help mitigate this pervasive bias and ensure objectivity?
It forces transparency and external validation. Researchers must adhere to established rules of rigor, such as institutional review boards or IRBs, ensuring ethical conduct, or using established methodologies for data collection.
Right.
We use techniques like triangulation, where we combine multiple sources data, say survey statistics, in-depth interviews, and historical records, to ensure the findings aren't dependent on one single subjective viewpoint. This systematic approach is how we move beyond anecdotal common knowledge.
That common knowledge is often the default setting for most people, drawn from those 5 major sources: personal experience, common sense, media, expert authorities, and tradition.
And while those sources are deeply influential in shaping individual views, their value is limited when trying to understand society as a whole. Your personal experience of a family, whether it's married, divorced, or single parent, may be unique, and it may lead you to assume that most families in your immediate area are similar.
But that's just an anecdote.
But without wider, scientifically gathered and rigorous research that controls for confounding variables and addresses potential bias, the personal experience is anecdotal and cannot be reliably generalized to the larger society. Sociology provides that crucial, wide-ranging, research-based perspective, replacing assumptions with evidence.
Okay, let's apply this rigorous methodology to our core focus, the sociology of gender. This is the sub-study area that applies that sociological lens to identity, looking specifically at gender, sexuality, gender expression, and gender identity, all the social meanings attached to sex.
And we begin with a precise sociological definition of gender. Gender is the culturally specific attitudes, behaviors, norms, and roles that a society or culture associates with an individual's sex assigned at birth.
Okay, so it's social.
Crucially, it refers to the socially constructed differences between female and male, and the specific cultural meanings attached to being feminine or masculine. This is entirely distinct from biological sex, which relates to physiological characteristics.
Once we adopt that definition of gender as a social construct, it immediately compels us to challenge the simple, rigid gender binary, the notion that someone is strictly, universally, and naturally either male or female.
Right.
Our research confirms that this binary is a cultural rule, not a human constant, and is absolutely not universal.
That realization is a cornerstone of the field. Anthropologists and sociologists have documented cultures across the globe that formally recognize and integrate more than two genders.
For real.
Among some indigenous tribes in North America, for instance, there were terms like bird-ache or the modern encompassing term two-spirit, referring to individuals who lived and dressed as a different gender than assigned at birth.
And this was accepted.
And often participated in the labor roles and rituals traditionally associated with that identity. These were not considered exceptions or deviations. They were acknowledged social positions.
And we see contemporary examples that challenge the binary, too, like the Samoan culture and the Fa'afafine.
Yes, the Fa'afafine, which translates roughly as the way of the woman. This term refers to individuals born biologically male who embody a fluid mix of both masculine and feminine traits.
Okay.
What's sociologically significant is their cultural status. They are not merely tolerated or marginalized. They're considered a recognized, important, and integrated third-gender role within Samoan culture, often playing crucial roles in family life and childcare.
Oh.
This complexity shows that the hard two-category division is a structural choice based on specific cultural histories, not a biological imperative.
The social construction of gender, therefore, helps us understand how and why expectations are placed on men's and women's characteristics and behavior, and fundamentally, how gender inequality arises from that construction.
And to understand that inequality, we have to look at the master power structure that shapes nearly all modern Western societies. Patriarchy.
Patriarchy means simply that men hold power. Our society was founded upon and continues to function based on these patriarchal ideas and institutions.
In a patriarchal society, characteristics associated with men and masculinity, such as assertiveness, dominance, emotional control, and a focus on abstract economic matters, hold inherently more power, authority, and economic valuation than those associated with women.
So it's a built-in value system.
This structural arrangement ensures that women, as a group, hold a systematically lower status than men in positions of political, economic, and institutional power.
And even the characteristics that are valued in women like empathy, emotional intelligence, nurturance, and care for others are often systematically ranked lower in the social hierarchy when it comes to institutional power or professional pay.
Exactly.
They are celebrated personally but devalued structurally.
This is a critical point. Because men are granted more structural advantages, rights, and access to capital, the systemic devaluation of typically feminine traits produces profound, measurable gender inequality across the entire social structure, from the corporate boardroom to family court. Moreover, patriarchy is the mechanism by which gender and sexuality are so closely linked. It implies that one's sex-gender identity must correlate to sexual attraction to the opposite gender, thereby upholding norms like the rigid homemaker breadwinner ideal that dominated the mid-20th century.
What's absolutely vital for a comprehensive deep dive is recognizing that patriarchy never operates in a vacuum. It has profound and specific historical racial implications that continue to impact society today.
Right.
It perfectly illustrates the essential role of intersectionality, which we will discuss further.
The history of race and gender in the U.S. is inseparable from economic and political control. For centuries, specifically since slavery, black men were systematically hypermasculinized and simultaneously hypersexualized by the dominant white culture.
And this had a purpose.
This narrative served a clear structural purpose. It painted black men as an inherent, uncontrollable threat to the perceived purity and fragility of white women, which then justified white men's use of violence and legal control to enforce racial segregation and deny black men economic and political rights.
And black women were subjected to a different but equally damaging narrative. They were often hypermasculinized, deemed less feminine, and painted as the antithesis of fragile, true womanhood.
This specific form of structural racism and sexism persists today, particularly through tropes like the strong black woman, who is seen as inherently resilient and needing less support,
Right.
or the persistent, deeply dangerous idea, still statistically documented in U.S. healthcare systems, that black women feel less pain than white women, leading to documented disparities in medical treatment and maternal mortality rates.
Meanwhile, other racial groups were subjected to parallel control-oriented gender tropes.
Consider Asian American men, who were historically demasculinized within this patriarchal racist structure, often painted as smaller, weaker, or passive. This is a cultural mechanism used to deny them status and power within the dominant white social and economic system.
Okay.
Conversely, Asian American women were hyperfeminized and reduced to sexually submissive objects, serving a different but equally controlling structural purpose within the patriarchal framework.
So you can't separate them.
Understanding the sociology of gender means understanding that gender roles and their associated privileges are always refracted through the lenses of race, class, and specific historical context.
Given that we live within and study a patriarchal society, it's not surprising that the early history of the field, the sociology of gender, was initially skewed.
It was.
For its first decades, it focused almost exclusively on women and was often called simply the sociology of women.
That early focus was rooted in the assumption that men were the universal default, the normative human subject in laws, stories, and history, while women were simply the other, the exception that needed explaining.
Because they weren't men.
Exactly. Their gender only mattered because they deviated from the male norm. This led to an initial necessary focus on documenting and analyzing the clear institutionalized inequalities that were believed to only affect women. Economic inequalities in work, legal restrictions on rights, disparities in healthcare, and the cultural expectations of home life.
And the necessity of that focus is undeniable when you look at the historical context, where women lacked basic rights like owning property or voting, and were often considered the legal property of their husbands or fathers.
Absolutely. The subfield itself is quite young, which is fascinating. While the term gender role was coined by John Money in 1955, the field only truly accelerated in the 1960s and 70s, concurrent with the second wave of the women's rights movement.
So it grew with the activism.
It did. Key theoretical breakthroughs included Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963, which gave voice to the discontent of privileged white middle-class housewives, and Anne Oakley's important 1969 research on women's attitudes to housework, which validated domestic labor as a subject of scientific study.
But those early studies were necessarily based mainly on women and femininity, largely ignoring masculinity and men, who were assumed to simply embody the structural norm.
That changed significantly with what is often termed the masculinities turn. The field shifted in the 1980s and 90s to the sociology of all genders. This is when foundational concepts brought men and masculinity explicitly into the analysis, viewing them as social constructs themselves, not just the default.
What were the key shifts in thinking that drove this change?
Two concepts are absolutely central to this transformation. First, Candace West and Don Zimmerman's 1987 work, Doing Gender.
Doing gender.
They argued that gender is not a fixed trait. It's an ongoing, routine, methodical, and recurring accomplishment, a performance carried out in front of others. It's what you do, not what you are.
So it's an action.
By making gender an action, they show that masculinity is just as constructed and precarious as femininity.
And second, there was Judith Butler's 1988 concept of gender as performative, which pushed that idea even further.
Yes, Butler argued that gender is not a voluntary act. It's a forced repetition of norms that creates the illusion of a stable internal gender identity.
Okay.
This, combined with the work of R.W. Connell and Michael Kimmel on hegemonic masculinity in the 1990s, solidified the field's move from simply the sociology of women to the sociology of gender relations and all genders.
Today, the core intellectual tool used in the contemporary field is gender analysis. This is the rigorous process of looking at human relationships, access to resources, government interaction, and social problems entirely through the lens of gender.
And the most important non-negotiable element of modern gender analysis is its insistence on using an intersectional approach. We cannot analyze gender in isolation.
This is perhaps the most transformative concept of the late 20th century in social science. It was coined by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in her pivotal 1991 paper, Responding to the Failures of the Legal System.
Crenshaw developed intersectionality to identify how multiple identities, race, class, gender, sensuality, age, ability, legal status, do not operate in isolation but overlap and influence each other simultaneously.
At the same time.
At the same time, these interlocking identities create complex hierarchies of power and oppression that cannot be understood by simply adding separate categories together.
As Crenshaw famously illustrated, a person is never received just as a woman or just as black. How that person is racialized immediately impacts how they are received as a woman and how their class background limits their access to resources.
Think of it like a complex, layered hierarchy, not a simple Venn diagram. The point of intersectionality is that the combined experience is qualitatively different from the sum of its parts.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
If a white woman experiences discrimination in the workplace, which is sexism, the legal remedy often focuses only on the sex-based category. But if a black woman experiences discrimination, her experience is often dismissed because the court cannot find proof that she was treated differently than all men, which ignores her race,
Right.
or differently than all women, which ignores her race again. Intersectionality reveals how structures of power compound and mutually reinforce discrimination, especially against those at the most marginalized edges of multiple categories.
We can apply this intersectional gender analysis to a concrete, seemingly neutral example, like analyzing dress codes in educational institutions.
Dress codes are perfect illustrations of ingrained power dynamics at work. When we analyze them intersectionally, we move beyond the simple goal of maintaining standards and look at the differential impact.
Right.
Often, dress codes disproportionately target girls for being distracting, reinforcing the sexualization of young women's bodies.
But the analysis has to go deeper still.
Yes. We must look at the different experiences for men, women, boys, girls, and LGBTQIA+ students, and then layer race and class onto that.
So multiple lenses.
For example, a policy against head wraps might disproportionately affect black girls whose hairstyles require protective wrapping. A policy about uniform cost might disproportionately affect low-income students. A policy restricting gender nonconforming attire disproportionately harms trans and non-binary students.
So a single rule has many different impacts.
The structure of the dress code policy, intended to be universal, becomes a tool for reinforcing patriarchy, classism, and racism through its differential enforcement.
And this framework forces us to recognize that power dynamics operate not only between the genders, that's the macropatriarchy, but critically within groups.
Absolutely. Even within the group labeled women, power dynamics are profoundly at play concerning access to resources and respect based on attractiveness, marital status, education level, sexuality, and race. Intersectionality demands we acknowledge these internal hierarchies. Gender analysis using this approach is the only way to accurately study how access to resources, power, and safety is truly distributed across society, validating the experiences of those who exist at the complex intersections of disadvantage. This exhaustive journey through the toolkit, the sociological imagination, social facts, social structure, and intersectionality, it leads us back to the central, pragmatic question. Why study the sociology of gender? Why dedicate this much intellectual rigor to these abstract concepts?
The answer is that we study it so we can clearly see the issues and structural inequalities around us, explore them rigorously with evidence, and then develop targeted solutions for a more equitable society.
Right.
If you don't know the structure is broken, you can't fix it.
This field helps us see why specific identities lead to specific measurable outcomes. For instance, why are females overwhelmingly socialized into professions like teaching, nursing, and caregiving, which are often systematically lower paid and hold less institutional power? The answer lies in the structural devaluation of traits associated with femininity, even if those traits are crucial to societal function. The study validates our personal experiences by placing them within these larger, predictable norms and standards.
And this knowledge allows us to move beyond personal anguish and ask those bigger questions that demand structural answers. Let's go back to our earlier example. The colleague who comes out as transgender and subsequently faces ostracism, bullying, or loss of employment. The personal tragedies they're suffering, but the sociological question has to be, why did that one piece of identity, an individual's self-determination, cause so much mass cultural resistance and structural harm?
And the sociological answer is always found in institutionalized discrimination. The problem is not with the individual who refuses to fit the established binary ideal of masculine-feminine or male-female.
It's not them.
The problem is built directly into society's institutionalized norms, values, roles, and expectations. In institutions ranging from hiring practices and corporate benefit packages to public safety policies, the established system is structured to exclude and punish those who deviate from the patriarchal, heteronormative binary.
So the individual doesn't fail.
The individual does not fail. The structure fails the individual.
This is where the sociology of gender proves its value. Scientific validation of patterns. The problems we see aren't just theories or feelings, they are measurable structural outcomes. Let's take the pay gap we mentioned in the intro.
The wage gap is not a theory. It is a meticulously documented social fact. Sociological research provides clear evidence by rigorously combining data. First, we use numerical statistical data comparing what men versus women make in the same fields and positions, often adjusted for experience and education.
Okay.
But we don't stop there. Second, we use qualitative data, the nuanced, recorded experiences of individuals and focus groups.
Why is combining those two data types so critical?
Because statistics alone can be dismissed by critics who argue, for example, that the gap is simply due to individual women making poor choices or prioritizing family over career.
Right, the personal trouble argument.
Exactly. But when you combine the hard numbers with qualitative data, you uncover the structural mechanism. You validate concepts like the motherhood penalty, the systemic reduction in wages and career opportunities women face immediately after having children, a penalty men rarely experience, or the sticky floor, the social forces that trap women in low-wage feminized occupations like childcare or social work. This holistic view provides the evidence base needed for collective action.
And this power of identifying shared, validated patterns is absolutely essential for effective activism and social change.
When a woman recognizes that her male colleagues advance faster, or when a black man realizes he's passed over for interviews based on systemic racial bias embedded even in candidate name recognition, recognizing these aren't isolated incidents, but rather shared societal patterns, that knowledge creates collective power and critical mass. It shifts the discussion from blame to systemic reform.
We see the direct results of this collective action in activist groups like the Human Rights Campaign, Moms Demand, Black Lives Matter, and the ACLU. They may have diverse missions, but they all fundamentally approach equity and rights by identifying and validating discriminatory patterns, which is sociological work, and then working together to change them through legal and political means.
Consider the example of the public restroom controversy we mentioned at the start. When activists and advocates push back against laws restricting transgender individuals, they're using gender analysis to point out that these laws are not about safety or logistics.
Right.
They are about using institutional control, state law, to reinforce the cisgender two-category binary. They are fighting institutionalized discrimination by validating the shared experience of exclusion.
And we can apply this critical analysis to media, too. We use the tools of gender analysis to dissect how advertisements and popular culture either perpetuate or attempt to challenge stereotypes, often with mixed results.
The sources provided excellent examples of this application, such as figures illustrating advertisements for Absolute Vodka or Coors Light that attempt to feature gay individuals.
On the surface, the inclusion seems positive. A proposal at a sports game. A slogan like, "Out is refreshing." It looks like cultural acceptance and marketing savvy.
But using a rigorous intersectional gender analysis, we have to look deeper at the unintentional messages and the overall structural reinforcement.
So what's really going on?
While attempting inclusion, these ads might still perpetuate specific stereotypes. For instance, the hypersexualization of gay men, which reduces complex identity to one dimension. Furthermore, they often subtly enforce a narrow, white, hegemonic masculinity ideal, or frequently miss the mark entirely by failing to include representation of BIPOC individuals within the LGBTQIA+ community.
So the sociological goal is to apply this critical eye to everything around us. What the ad is trying to sell versus the unintentional structural messages it is sending about power, race, and who truly belongs in the American narrative.
Right.
Does it reinforce gendered expectations, or does it genuinely and constructively challenge them using an intersectional framework? That shift in perspective is the ultimate takeaway of this deep dive. #outro.
This deep dive began with us questioning society and moving from individual experience to structural analysis. We use the rigorous scientific methods of sociology and the analytical power of the sociological imagination to peel back layers of norms, institutions, and structural problems related specifically to gender.
We've established that in order to truly address social ills, to tackle the pay gap, or to counter institutionalized discrimination, we must first validate and explain the structural patterns that led to those problems in the first place, moving the entire discussion from subjective opinion to objective scientific evidence.
And as you reflect on everything we've discussed today, from the rigidness of social structures to the pervasive coercion of compulsory heterosexuality, consider this final provocative thought.
Sociologist Karen Martin showed us that gendered heteronormative socialization starts profoundly young. Parents routinely assume heterosexuality in their children as young as 3 and 5 years old.
3 and 5.
That assumption, that structural expectation, is built into the very fabric of early family life, reinforced by media, religion, and the law. If this unseen social structure begins actively limiting our choices and defining our options, our career paths, our relationship goals, our sense of self-determination, long before we are even cognitively aware of identity, how profoundly does this pervasive, deeply ingrained assumption shape every other area of our daily lives, even for those who identify as heterosexual? What fundamental, taken for granted concepts are limiting your choices, your opportunities, or your understanding of yourself right now? It is a question that requires the full force of your sociological imagination.